when I went to London for Elektra, we opened up, the office was basically in the office of the distributor, Elektra's former importer. And the office was right smack dab in the middle of Soho. And this was the summer, I went there in the autumn of '65, and I lasted in the job for a year till I got fired. But that year in Soho was incredible. It was so full of activity, and there were hustlers and people doing things all over the place. And I would meet people in the pubs with incredible stories and connections. And anyway, it was just the most incredible introduction to the world of British pop music in the mid-'60s. In the summer of 1966, I had a Tuesday evening ritual for dignitaries visiting London. Chinatown for dinner at Lee Ho Fook, then a walk up Wardour Street to the Marquee for the weekly residency of The Move. Now, I know a number of you are here are from Britain. Do most of you know who The Move are? Yeah. Did anybody ever see The Move live in their... Okay.
Nobody saw them except you, Joe.
That's right.
That's
why I'm here. That's why you have to buy this book.
You're the only living testimonial.
I got the sweetest message from some of The Move after the book came out. Anyway, John Sebastian and Zal Yanofsky, Paul Butterfield and Mike Bloomfield, Jack Holtzman, Phil Oakes, and a few others got this treatment. And privileged they were. For The Move in their prime were a phenomenon few Americans had the privilege of seeing. I have fantasized about what might have happened had they made it to Monterey Pop or the Fillmore. I think American audiences would have been as astonished as they were by The Who or Hendrix. The Move were ambitious working class kids from Birmingham, no desire to change the face of music, preach peace and love, or promote altered consciousness. They just wanted to be rich and famous. They attacked the audience with volume and speed from the off. Their own songs, Motown B-sides, even Zing Went the Strings of My Heart, were all delivered with power, turn on a dime, tempo changes, and rich harmonies screamed in perfect pitch by four voices, two of them usually falsetto. There were no long Frisco-style jams. The intricate arrangements foreshadowed and, in my view, overshadowed the grandiosity of later groups like Yes. Their music verged on psychedelia, but it was a beer drinker's psychedelia. Roy Wood, the sort of genius of the group, may have taken his share of acid in later years, but initially he just incorporated sounds coming up from the underground, magpie-like, into the Move's music. They made a far superior job of deconstructing soul tunes than did Vanilla Fudge a year later. And everything was always moving faster and faster, more and more dazzling harmonies, arrangements, and power. The confidence was overwhelming. The Move would finish off a set with an instrumental coda to an original, let's say, I Can Hear the Grass Grow, perhaps. One by one, they would leave the stage. Instruments leaning against the amps, screaming feedback, until only Bevan remained, pounding out a stentorian drum solo. This is Bev Bevan, later of Electric Light Orchestra. He would fiddle with something behind the bass drum before joining the others in the wings. The empty stage roared at the crowd in the tiny club until Bev's enormous firecracker exploded. The roadie yanked the master plug, and the audience was left in smoky silence, staring dumbfounded at the stage. Mike Bloomfield and John Sebastian both told me it was the most amazing thing they'd ever seen. As far as I know, there are no recordings of the original lineup's live shows. As dressing room visitors groped for superlatives, the group would murmur incomprehensible brummy acknowledgments, tug their forelocks, and saunter out to the van for the ride back to the celestial city. I was desperate for them to join Butterfield, Love, The Doors, and Tim Buckley in Elektra's growing stable of rock artists, and I thought I was getting farther with their manager, Tony Secunda, and producer, Denny Cordell, than I had with Robert Stigwood when I tried to sign the Cream to Elektra. Looking back, it seemed I was little more than a shill, a naive American bidding up their value, as Cordell maneuvered for his label deal with EMI. Just before I got sacked, I took a Holtzman up to Birmingham to meet them in one last desperate throw of the dice. I wish there was a tape recording of the post-gig conversation in the cramped dressing room of the Edgbaston Mecca Ballroom. Among the impressed but awkward Holtzman, the very earnest me, the Fagin-like Secunda, and the monosyllabic move. The man who persuaded Jim Morrison and Arthur Lee to sign with Elektra was way too far from home to make any impression on the move. The hits Cordell eventually produced with them were compact 3-minute bits of pop with psychedelic spice, tailored for the British singles market. In America, Country Joe and the Fish and Grateful Dead were beginning to imagine the kind of extended tracks that would transform the shape of rock recording. But there was no place for that in the British music scene until Pink Floyd redrew the map. Cordell and Secunda were an unlikely pair, but they enjoyed success after success from 66 to 68. The Move, Procol Harum, and Joe Cocker. Secunda came from South London and had knocked around the worlds of music and professional wrestling since the early 60s. He was a cartoon villain, a reptilian hustler who bragged of his time in prison, but was possessed of a ready wit and a sinister charm. Cordell was as dapper and cool as Secunda was fevered and scheming. There were other pairings like this around Soho, the Cockney Chris Stamp and the Bohemian aristocrat Kit Lambert managing The Who, for example. Soho that year was like the Steps in AD 350, with the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Huns queuing up to pillage, destabilize, and eventually take over the Roman Empire. Lambert, Stamp, and The Who were set to follow in the westward footsteps of Andrew Oldham and the Stones and Brian Epstein's Beatles. Stigwood was setting the stage for Clapton's new Cream. Expatriate Jimi Hendrix was preparing for his triumphant return home under the aegis of Chas Chandler and Mike Jeffries. And Steve Winwood's career was being masterminded by Chris Blackwell. In the coming year, the list would grow. Jethro Tull and 10 years after with Chris Wright and Terry Ellis. Led Zeppelin with Peter Grant. The Move, in their failure to conquer America, were the exception. America had no equivalent of these managerial hustlers. The Brill Building types who built rock and roll empires had little notion of how to deal with an artist who wrote his own songs and took acid. Grossman knew, Albert Grossman, but he was content to lie back in Woodstock, building a studio in a Chinese restaurant and muttering gnomic pronouncements to quaking agents and record company bosses via long-distance telephone. The new British managers were willing to put in the hard graft to take America and were determined to enjoy it. The working-class Barrow Boys took such pleasure in the sound of their own spiels that they made for highly entertaining company. The aristocrats among them had been born to avoid trade, but if one couldn't, at least it had to be amusing. Thugs like Grant and Don Arden resembled Lee Marvin in Point Blank. Executives in plush offices couldn't believe anyone would be so vicious and gave in to them just to have a peaceful life. The Yank who paid the most attention to all of this, of course, was David Geffen. The brilliance of the British managers flowed from the same fount as their flaws. They believed everyone needed a gimmick. Townsend smashing one guitar and Hendrix burning another on stage at Monterey made them overnight stars in America. Both gestures, like Bev Bevan's Firecracker, were part of a British tradition of artifice. New York would never have molded Hendrix's genius into as powerful a pop persona as London did. When it worked, it was brilliant, but when it didn't, it could go very wrong. Secunda alienated the Move and cost them a fortune when he packaged one of their singles in a libelous cartoon about Harold Wilson. Mike Jeffries never understood Hendrix the musician. He put him with an English rhythm section and thought that was the appeal. Two white guys with a flashy black one in the middle. When Hendrix wanted to work with his peers like Billy Cox and Buddy Miles, Jeffries' only response was to sabotage the new lineup, helping to drive Jimmy into the despair he was in when he died. I never understood why Secunda didn't send the move to San Francisco on spec. For all his cleverness, he couldn't grasp the changes that were transforming the American market. Cordell got it. He rode a whiter shade of pale and, with a little help from my friends, into the sunset, settling in Los Angeles, forming Shelter Records, and discovering Leon Russell and Tom Petty. In a melancholy footnote to their long sundered partnership, Denny and Tony, both in their early 50s, died within days of each other in 1995. Denny in Ireland, where he had trained racehorses, and Tony in Marin County, Northern California, where he published guidebooks to American national parks. They held a memorable Irish wake for Denny, full of devoted friends from all periods of his colorful life. I sometimes imagine Tony, the ex-wrestling promoter from Streatham, sitting in the Trident restaurant on the Sausalito waterfront, eating his organic salad, gazing at the sailing boats out on the bay, and regretting the move's missed chance.